So welcome to this specific think tank session. So we got a lot of chance to that. We got a very interesting panel. People who will teach us a lot of, will bring us their experience as researchers, as professionals in the world of think tanks, and at the same time, um, set a panel that will help us progress and think. A panel with five persons, and they will have first a short introduction for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we will start or kick off a dialogue with the audience, and we'll be happy to answer your questions to go deeper into the topic. The theme of this session is over a superpower or coalition of medium-sized powers. Here we got the Chinese bloc, the US bloc, and it was mentioned, and we feel some kind Europe has been has lost its might. Other countries have to obey the boss, and what is the space for something else? Power in the 21st century. So we need, the BRICS are trying to, find to be another bloc. So this panel is going to enlighten us here. First speaker will be Alexander Medvedovsky, who is the president of the from Remington. Then they will hear Shekhar Aikar, who will speak English, but there will be interpretation into French, who is the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. And we're very honored and happy to have you with us, sir. Then Douglas Redeker, who will also speak English, from the Brookings Institution. He's a senior researcher in the Brookings Institution, and they will talk about geoeconomics. And then we'll have with us Maria Elena Aguero, Secretary General of the Club de Madrid. And finally, last but not least, Charles Lickfield, from the Director of Prospective in Economic Analysis at the Atlantic Council. So just allow me to say a couple of introductory words. What is the coherence between the various speakers? Well, in fact, there is a significant coherence from the various contributions we'll hear. I don't know how you see the world, but as an economist, I was absolutely convinced by I'm a European, so I'm in the I've been educated with Montesquieu, soft trade. When you trade, you don't go to war. So the period of enlightenment in a global world, where we trade and where we have families with 2 kids, with democratic values. So I was this kind of universal idea, which is very Europe-centric. The world, vision of the world. And I have to say, and in the European construction, this is, we were at war with each other for centuries. Let's have a single market, war is over. That was the idea. Then Angela Merkel did a pipe between Russia and Germany to transport gas, and then we got the war in Ukraine. You can trade and go to war anyway. That was a shock for me, actually. And I think, this is a different vision of the world, and disregard from the, disregard of the former colonial power to the rest of the world. Alexander will talk. Alexander will have a different vision and talk about where we come from since the end of Second World War and the evolutions we experienced. And Shekhar will help us to step back, have a higher vision, because the countries that go to war still, international trade has increased in the last year. Trade is very much like water. It's always find a way to see through, and Shekhar will explain his theory, will enlighten us, because there are countries who are actually connectors, interfaces, and this could be a role to more modest countries, Douglas, will give us his views on obstacles to the advent of middle powers and their obstacles, and then we want to hear him. We're very eager to see what he can propose versus the China-US hegemony. And Maria has a great experience. He will tell us how to go beyond obstacles, the advent of true middle powers, and especially through coalitions. She embodies this concept. And finally, Charles will discuss the failure of the G2, China, US, and we don't want to be, we don't want to yield. So let's see what the evolution. So great coherence for people who've never met, actually, because the ideas that underlie their work, are not that numerous. So with no further ado, Alexander. Thank you. Hello, and good afternoon to the other members of the panel. I'm not a member of a think tank. I'm not a researcher. I'm a business manager. I'm a company manager. I'm a European, so a double cap, manager and European. That I will say a couple of words of introduction, trying not to be too long and to respect the 4 minutes given to me. So first, let me say that power struggles are more between powers, superpower or middle powers. It's good to have this discussion. It's no longer something that is left to the diplomats, the experts, to the geographers or the historians. It can be seen in the business of companies, in their supply chain, in their financing process, in their technology, and even in their board of directors. So this is a topic that is of interest to businesses, which means for me that this roundtable is a very concrete, very highly operational topic, not intellectual at all. And what we want to know if middle powers we belong to are still able to organize themselves sufficiently in order not to have to yield to the choices of the US or China. Well, I would say 4 things to try to open the discussion. First point, I do believe that we are in a major change versus what we have known since the end of World War II. Following the 2 world wars in the European nations to which we belong, we're able to go from the state of imperial and war-mongering nations to that of Pacific democratic nation that would cooperate and will for more integration at every level, and this is the birth of the European Union until the first circle, the Eurozone, and this for a long time, European countries the status as the medium or middle power. A country like France. Collectively, we've learned throughout the years to be happy with this status, coming out to history, convinced that the US military umbrella would protect us all the time. Until the Brexit 2016, 10 years, and the first election of Trump, November 2016, the war started by Russia, Ukraine, February 2022. The European Union, kind of thing. So we have a true coalition of medium-sized powers, middle powers. There are multilateral institutions in the world. Very much like the application of the law, international law. So this is what we've seen in the last decade. The collapse, actually, the intellectual and operational framework of the post-Second World War has been erased to the benefit of conflictual rising of the US and of China. And this competition we experience today, 2 superpower is seen. This is seen in all powers: financial, economic, technological, standards, everything. So for business as we are, this is of course a huge challenge. We have to deal and to have to learn new rules, explicit, implicit rules, the new game, more aggressive, more competitive, sometimes without any rules and with a deep challenging of our basis. This could damage our industries. We see it with the European automotive industry. Second point, superpower are the winners of a happy globalization. I'll spare you the cliches, but we can see clearly, I don't know what my colleagues think, but the period we experience is super domination of the two superpowers, that is China and the US. And if we are not cautious enough, and if we cannot react in Europe, this will last quite a long time. And this applies through to the technological domination, their capacity to impose rules like extraterritoriality, and then the way they can massively finance their growth and investment. As the Prime Minister from Canada said in Davos, middle democratic powers have to review their national doctrine and alliance doctrine, and he asked for, for the alliance of middle powers. So, anyway, a lot of things are to be made to make this credible, especially in Europe, where we can see, even though there is the European, we cannot say that this alliance of middle power is sufficient to be present in this competition and this rivalry between the two superpowers. Third point in my introduction is that the struggle starts in our head, in our minds. That is, we are not going to lead our populations to dream. We come up with a slogan that we need, middle size or middle powers. Great people, you all get sit around the table, and we have an alliance of medium powers. It's not concrete, it's not sexy, and then we have to go beyond the framework of that discussion to go further. And as you said earlier on, and I fully agree with you, I think that more than ever, what is at stake is that of defense, the promotion, and actualization of European model. Our societies are highly resilient because they're democratic, because they are educated, they're protected, and they carry humanistic values, which is their basis. This is what is being challenged today, threatened. And now we businesses, sometimes we feel we are the last wall, of the to preserve this European way of life. Everywhere there are populist programs in Europe and elsewhere. They attack industries, academics, knowledge, innovation. These damage and challenge the perennity and viability of the European project. This is the major challenge, and I don't know if we'll discuss that, but I think what's so special about France is when we see the coexistence of a very high extreme right and extreme left. This is, in my opinion, these are threats. For the equilibrium of the entire European continent. I think the next presidential election in France is essential versus what's going on all over Europe. We need banks, we need insurance companies, we need investment funds, strong, prosperous. We need capitals to invest in AI and in decarbonation. We need our universities, our research centers to attract the best researchers and academics. And we need strong military power. We need autonomous defense with better technology, better equipped. Middle power should neither be alone or weak. As we said, we have to accept that sometimes force needs to be employed. Last point, our businesses are key role to play in the rearmament of the European continent. We managers, we have to clearly get to it, leaders, governors, shareholders, subcontractors. I think we have to have a general mobilization in companies so that each and everyone should be aware of the fact that the superpower, middle power dialectic is not in our favor. So our companies should anticipate, should know the world. Business managers should know more than just status of a business manager, to be players of globalization, and should not leave it to the government and the state. I think this is a challenge. If we don't do rearmament with solid companies, with technologies well controlled, and if we don't have the leaders who can go into power struggles, well, we will not rearm a continent with incantations. Europe will not be a coalition of middle power, but just an open market, open to predators.
My inability to speak French. I should also note that this is the first time I've ever spoken to an audience with headphones on. So I don't know how this is going to go.
You can take your headphones out when you talk. If someone talk, maybe you will use it. But
That's so much better. Okay, so as an economist, let me tackle this question from the point of view of international economic engagements. There is a nascent field called geoeconomics, which is actually examining some of these issues, and different people do different things. The bit of the literature that I'm engaged with measures international geopolitical distance on the basis of voting patterns at the United Nations. So there's a trio of political scientists at Georgetown University who put together a database which looks at UN voting patterns and calculates the bilateral geopolitical distance between any two countries at any given point in time. It's a very rich data set because it's got time variance as well as 183 countries. So in some sense, it's much more granular than dividing the blocks into, say, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, or the China bloc and the Western bloc. This is something which is what economists call... You can't hear me?
No, the guy
okay. Okay, so that's the fundamental essence of what these geoeconomists are doing. And there's a bunch of economic researchers who have found that all kinds of bilateral economic engagement fall with geopolitical distance. That is true of trade, that is true of foreign direct investment, it's true of portfolio investment, it's true of cross-border banking flows. They all fall dramatically with geopolitical distance, which actually turns out to be more important than geographical distance and has been rising in importance at a faster rate than geographical distance. So this phenomenon has been called geoeconomic fragmentation. And there are many scholars who have kind of modeled what would happen if there was a complete decoupling of the world economy, and they have found that the consequences would be very severe. You could have a hit of 7 to 12% of GDP, depending on the details of the decoupling, whether it was restricted to trade, whether it also included technology transfers, investment, and became a broader phenomenon. So clearly, it's something to be extremely worried about. Now, my own recent work has focused on the idea of connector countries. And this, again, is a complicated issue, but the particular kind of connector country I'm looking at would be called diversification in financial theory. So if you're a well-diversified investor, the essence of a good portfolio is to have lots of assets which are relatively uncorrelated with each other. So if one asset fails, you've still got a lot of other assets to fall back on. A similar principle applies to diversification across the geopolitical spectrum. The idea is that a well-diversified country trades with everyone across the geopolitical spectrum. In some sense, it's quite different from a coalition. This is about diversification, about risk management, and so, for the quantitatively inclined, the relevant metric is the variance of your trade-weighted geopolitical distance from all your trade partners. And when you do that calculation, you find that my country, India, is actually in the top quartile of diversified countries. To give you a flavor of which other countries there are, there's a lot of Asian countries in there. Countries like Vietnam and Cambodia are among the most diversified countries in the world. They are open to all comers, as it were. So this is essentially the work that I've done, and I'm happy to expand on it, and I'm happy to explain the virtues of it. You can put it into a classical, what's called an Armington trade model. So in a typical trade model, you have something called iceberg costs. And iceberg costs are a way of modeling how far away you are geographically, because icebergs melt as you travel long distances. But what you can do in a clever kind of way is substitute iceberg costs with geopolitical distance. And when you do that and you develop a trade model, one thing that drops out of that as a sort of virtue or something that is highly desirable is exactly the kind of diversification index that I've talked about. So if you ask me for my prescription on what middle powers should do, the answer is simple. Be like a well-diversified investor, trade with everybody, invest with everybody, try not to exclude anybody, and when you're signing bilateral free trade deals, be very careful that a bilateral free trade deal with one particular country does not seek to tie your hands or your freedom of action with third countries. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Donc, on voit, c'est très intéressant.
This is most interesting, these two presentations, because business focused, and it is quite common that and they're often below radars from public authorities and from the domestic policies, especially the European vision. We should trade with people who have share only our values. You see, the Asian vision is more pragmatic, different. We trade with everybody, doesn't matter. We don't deal with the internal in domestic policy. It's another doctrine. I'm not saying the equivalent, but it's another doctrine. And companies, of course, do business because that's what they do. And therefore, it makes it possible, in my opinion, to involve countries or to involve countries in a way which is difficult to stop afterwards. For example, if you want to stop the war in Iran, there is an economic reason. It could be a vector for peace. Montesquieu wasn't totally wrong. So thank you, Sheka, for your declaration. I will now give the floor to Douglas, who will give us a more political vision of how we can build the middle powers with this vision above. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Washington, D.C. based, but I lived in Europe for almost 20 years, so I'm very pleased to be back here. But I must say, after 2 days, I'm a little troubled by the dichotomy between the U.S., where I have to tell you the narrative is about two things. It's always about Trump. We'll get to that. But it's about AI. It's about AI every minute of every day on every topic. And it has been blissfully pleasant for the past several days to be here in France at this conference, where AI has been an ancillary topic. It has not been ignored, but it is not the only thing that we are discussing. So I start with that because framing the world through an AI-dominated prism changes the way we're going to discuss everything. Middle powers and everything else on the agenda for this event. If we take that aside and say it's one of many, many different issues, which is what this event has been so far, that's great. But I just want to say, for me, that's a blissfully, it's a relief to not be focused on both the opportunities and the threats posed by AI, which is really all we are doing in the U.S. Now, I also want to start by saying I'm not a particular supporter of the current president of the United States. My background as an American here, I feel I have to establish where I am on the spectrum here. I served in the Obama administration. I was an early supporter of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. And I have to tell you that this is not the era of multilateralism of the Obama era. This is an era where the direction of travel is towards a world in which money, power, and technology are increasingly dominant. And in Donald Trump's worldview, might makes right and divide and conquer are the only things that matter, and they are the threats to new economic models, to old economic models, to political allegiances and alliances, and that's separate from the threats and opportunities posed to humanity by AI. And I say to humanity not because I'm trying to be a dire existentialist here, but because actually the closer you get to AI, the more scary it actually is in terms of what it can and is likely to do to upending existing models. But we are living in Donald Trump's mindset from the US perspective, at least, and this is a panel on US and China as the superpowers and middle powers and what they can and should be able to do in response. We're living in an era of escalation, dominance, and world power, which is dominated by the US and China. I heard a speaker yesterday talk about the EU's enormous power of its collective trading bloc. That's true. But I also heard this morning one of the speakers acknowledge that the Turnberry Trade Accord between the EU and the US represented an abject capitulation by Europe to US pressure. So it is one thing to say Europe has a collective trading bloc that should be a power on par with the US or China. It is another to see whether it is manifesting itself in action. So middle powers collectively have the ability to join together and to resist this directional narrative. The EU reflects the best effort the world has ever seen at middle power cohesion, institutions, and governance. But it lacks sufficient strategic power and effective governance to get almost anything done. Now, the BRICS are almost the opposite. They reflect enormous middle power ambition, but they lack cohesion, they lack a governance structure, they have a collective aversion to the US-led status quo, but that is not the same as a shared strategic project and creating the tools to achieve it. So the lessons from both the BRICS and the EU are the same. Existing middle power structures do not yet present a real challenge to the superpower heft of the United States and China. It is hard to get countries that have been rivals for generations, for centuries, to make the compromises necessary to act with a strategically cohesive voice. Now, that is particularly troubling in two areas, AI and finance. And those are the areas that middle powers are at greatest risk, because AI requires speed. Living in Washington, picking up the newspaper every day, it is extraordinary to see where we were 6 weeks ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, relative to where we are now and where we're going in AI and technology. It is moving fast. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine in December urging Europe to act because they were in an era of crisis. And that was 6 months ago. The crisis is much more accelerated than it was when I wrote the piece. In finance, the EU, I say this everywhere I go. Whenever I give a talk in Europe, I have to say this. The IMF wrote a paper in 2023 pointing out that the EU, the Eurozone, could raise 15% of Eurozone GDP through a collective Euro bond issuance without any aggregate increase in cost. 15% of Eurozone GDP is roughly $3 trillion. Now, when you hear at all the panels about all of the cost-benefit sacrifices everybody's being asked to make in France, in Europe, everywhere, imagine what you could do with 3 trillion euros of costless capital. And when I say costless, what I mean is it does not raise the borrowing costs of any other country in the aggregate for doing so. But we know that there are countries in Europe that refuse to actually agree to a common borrowing instrument. But I'm using that as an example because whether it's AI or finance, the two areas I'm focused on, the ability to step up and actually challenge the existing status quo led by the US and China is there. The question is there a collective will to do so? And unfortunately, to date, I'm not seeing the crisis being reflected in actual action.
Thank you so much. So, benefit if we are able to, pardon.
There are major benefits if Europe should Europe become more coordinated, but we don't have the solutions for the time being. Businesses are there, they do their business, they do their job. Europe, many obstacles, many gains, many obstacles. I will now give the floor to Maria, who will propose solutions because daily action with the Club de Madrid. Club de Madrid. Not the Club d'Europe, the Club de Madrid. So sorry, I went to Italy recently. I visited Italy recently, that's why. So, and therefore, and she will propose solutions because for the time being, it's a bit sad what we're hearing. We should have a bit of hope. How can we get a bit of hope? And of course, you can speak English if you wish.
Sorry, thank you very much. I will speak in English because it's easier. So bear with me, and Carlos, I'm sorry, but they always confuse. But chime in, please, because that will be good. Some of them have many solutions, and that's what they've been all about. But I think it's important to step back a little bit and think of the fact that the whole concept of middle power is not new. We hear a lot about it, and we've heard a lot about it in recent months because of Mark Carney's speech in Davos. But it is nothing new conceptually. And it was used, there was reference to it during the Cold War quite a bit because of, in the Cold War, we had bipolar confrontations, precisely between the US and Russia and their relations. But in that period of time, post-war, post-World War, but in the Cold War, there were countries like Canada or Sweden or in, the Netherlands who were able to exercise certain influence, who were able to move the needle in certain areas. But gradually, we saw unipolarity and the rise of the U.S. as a unipolar power, and then around 2008. Started to lose some of that power, and unipolarity moved again into more of a broader situation. No, more. I wouldn't say multipolar as we have or we're discussing today, but yes, more of a triangular where we had increasingly this three. There's China, U.S., China, Russia situation, but all of this is not only because of the crises, the succeeding crises, be it the financial crisis, then COVID, then the Russia-Ukraine war, but also because the U.S. seemed to want to step back and not, and there wasn't, or there was decreasing, it seemed, decreasing political will to continue being the sole guarantor of a number of issues, of areas, including peace, including trade, including a number of different areas. Now, with Carney's speech at Davos, um, I think we see that he takes this idea of middle powers one step forward. When he said that the old order isn't coming back, when he seemed to be so definitive, you know, and so in many ways also defensive. It was more of a let's be clear, let's take guard because this is this situation is not going to change. I mean, we went from talking a few years back about this Thucydides trap and the fact that there was changes, there was change coming, but the new power, the old power was stepping down or moving backwards, and the new power wasn't just there yet there. But we see in the case of Carney's statements in Davos that he was, much more on the defensive, saying, we've got to protect ourselves, we've got to, and in that sense, he pointed not only to Canada but to other middle powers, and it was also this going back to a reference or thoughts of variable geometries where there were flexible alliances, more flexible associations, if you wish, or coalitions based on shared interest. And this goes a bit to the connectors that Shekhar was talking about. But one thing that Carney did not do, I mean, he raised the issue, he raised the problem, but one thing that he did not do is to say how. How are these coalitions to be formed, to be built, and central tension that exists? Because on the one hand, the whole proposition is defensive, as I was saying earlier, but on the other hand, it has to, in order for it to happen, it has to be constructive, and we see that there are moves. We see that there are, in the case of Europe, there is an increase in agreements with Mercosur, agreements with India, agreements with Indonesia, and a lot of it, as Ariel said at the beginning, is happening around trade. Trade seems to be the connector or the space within which these alliances and these coalitions can increasingly take place. But there is this tension that I think is important to keep in mind as to are we talking about the defensive, the protection of sovereignty? Are we talking about the cooperation where trying to find alliances that allow for cooperation when the great powers or the superpowers are not willing to cooperate, but rather are in confrontation. When we look at it from a more constructive perspective, then it's that possibility that many, and including Carney, I think, see in redesigning the international rules and the governance and the architecture. And so all of this is what we're seeing. As far as the coalitions are concerned, we see a space for coalitions, we see a space for alliances, but it's not only a matter of political will or of saying, yes, we want to work together, we want to cooperate. It's also a matter of having the institutional capacity and the governance capacity to do so. And that is lacking. And so in that sense, we have to look at the possibilities of coalescing from the two perspectives, both from political will, but also from the actual capacity that may exist in doing so.
Thank you very much for that. And last but not least, pardon, alors, ça y est, je reviens au français. Pardon, donc Charles.
Charles, now we'll talk about the G2. Back to that. We go round this couple, you know, the US-China couple. So how can we go overcome this and avoid becoming vassals? Back to French, even though I've been living in Washington for quite a while. You know, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk with Doug. You know, I'm the last speaker, hence I will just tell you what I don't agree with from the speakers, and then I'll shut up so that we could have a real discussion. G2. Well, I wanted to talk about it because G2 is something Trump wanted. Trump loves to be invited to Beijing, to be received in the Forbidden City, red carpet, or the anti-decorum, you know. He loves the Arc of Triumph as well. But, you know, he loves his relationship with China because it's very simple. It's basic. It says, I can trade with China, I can have deals with China, and it's an easy way to find solutions and eventually to reassure himself about his own power. What happened in the last 18 months is that China has demonstrated to the US that it has margin of maneuvers versus the US. The US still have a lot, but less than China. China now has imposed the end of the trade war by prohibiting the US from importing some technologies which are necessary to the production lines, especially in the automotive industry. So China dictates the pace. So talking about the G2 is reassuring for Trump to say, two, we can negotiate and discuss difficult issues. It's even more difficult for the US to compare themselves with the Chinese, especially when even with the topic we discussed today. Now, for those who will come after Trump, I fear that the Chinese-American relationship will be worse because Trump loves this relationship because he loves being received in Beijing, but his successors will see the rivalry with China as a priority. So there will be a degradation in all scenarios, be it Democrat or Republican. You know, things will get bad. Not reassuring for Europe. Your transatlantic is more transactional, which means that they should, you know, we become vassals anyway. But to pull out of this, there are margins of maneuver. Colleagues talked about it, the Union of Capital Markets, to go further in innovation. The variable that is missing, you know, there is a European regulation which still has a weight. You know, they were saying, you know, the legislative process in the US is so dysfunctional that it cannot have issue a law to govern AI, finance, or, you know, the private data management. So Europe has this leverage. Europe is able to do regulation, but it's not sufficient. Until 5 years ago, it could be reassured by saying, okay, we've adopted, you know, the large GPT, and the US had to adopt it because they could not do without a market. Now it's different. There's an iPhone which is compatible with European regulation, and the other one is not. So if Europe cannot longer be a player, it's because there are lack of growth and a lack of innovation. To compensate for that, well, we've talked about solutions. But I fear, because soon we'll be enter the electoral period, that this message hasn't yet come through in your growth is a condition, major condition to be a key player. So just a couple of points necessarily of disagreement, but for different views, counting. Well, I did listen to his speech in Davos, which was brave enough to face, Trump. All the speeches in Davos were not necessarily showing much bravery, but Carney was. However, there was a slight incoherence. At the beginning of the speech, he said, "We knew it was very hypocritical. We know that." Western order or Occidental world benefited us, but not everybody else. So then he said, let's rebuild it amongst middle countries. This is something slightly incoherent, but it was a brave, bold speech. We can talk about the hypocrisy of the West. I know that the European Union has signed agreement with Mercosur and India. In France, where people are not quite happy about it, but and sometimes to be jealous in some of the world, part of the world, but the imposition of values in the world is perceived as kind of it's a bit, the carbon footprint for food, as a sign of a very hypocritical action. So, last point, this is something I wanted to add. My Indian colleague talked about it. India as a transition country to compensate the Chinese domination. Unfortunately, in such an unpredictable world as today, the US wanted to move the co-production to India, but the next day they imposed tariffs to India because they said they bought too much oil. Whereas the previous administration said buy oil from Russia, and Trump doesn't want to criticize Russia, but he criticized India and imposed custom rights. So, politics is unpredictable to our custom duties. So so things are too complicated, so too emotional. So it's going to be tricky. So we haven't solved the problems of middle powers. Fair enough. Let's face it. Trade is okay. It's holding. Businesses can trade. They do business. There are countries and mainly nations or businesses who are intermediates or connectors. This is why trade continues. But politics is not a solution or not an obvious one or not an easy one. This is what I get from this discussion so far. Now, I would like to give the floor to the audience. This is the purpose. It's a more friendly, round-the-table discussion. So please make sure that you speak in the microphone. Yes, I need a microphone. Thank you. You said that politics doesn't work for middle powers, doesn't work, but trade works. Question. It's not easy to do industrial cooperation between France and Germany. We've seen that. There is no European company. We have waited decades to get the status. So this coalition, I've asked the question early on before coming here to Jean-Noël Barrot. He said, oh, it's not very well. Everybody wants an alliance, but middle powers and middle alliance. Those are political slogans. It's not sufficient. So now, could one of you mention an example of industrial alliance between a Canadian, French, German, Indian company in the domain of rare earths, critical materials? Look at the CMAS AGM, the manager was there. It just bought logistics in the US, 2.5 billion. He bought in the US, not in Canada. Well, of course, he has a container ship in India built, but they all work on cost and opportunity. So what is the content, economic content, raw material, everything that could be labeled middle power to avoid the China-US hegemony? So do you have any knowledge of a project in progress, or is it possible? Who would like to take this? I'll share your views. Examples we can mention of cooperation between middle powers at the European level, don't concern the topics you mentioned, but nevertheless, we do have a few. Airbus, for example, in aeronautics, was the splendid example of cooperation between different countries, not just France and Germany, by the way, Spain, and it does work. And you know, there was an amazing. This is now a global company which is Boeing's rival. So in the domain of missiles, MBDA. Earlier on, I could see at the end of the morning the CEO was there, and this is also a European cooperation business, including with the British, and which shows that. In that respect, we can be as good as the largest corporations in a given domain. But those two examples are the trees that are hiding the forest, and in fact, we would like to have many more. But at the same time, we can see that always in aeronautics, a European plane doesn't work, fighter plane doesn't work among European nations. In the special domain, it's very complicated to have technologies we clearly need to have European cooperation. So you talked about the rare earths, critical materials. Well, clearly a lot of things need to be done. A lot of things need to be done, and this is a huge field. What strikes me is that we have a feeling that European Union, European Commission, and many European commissioners are now aware of that. And for a couple of years now, they're trying to do smart things. I don't know if Thierry Breton is there, but he was a major European commissioner, and he said very strong things. And he initiated strong projects, especially in space. Though there are several funding or financing mechanisms which are being mobilized in Europe to be able to invest in AI, in the quantum computing space, so that small companies, could be companies would have no problem to then finance their growth and become global leaders. So whereas until now, it is when you had problems and difficulties. So we're good in Europe to invent. We're good in Europe to do research. We got major research labs. We got amazing training schools, amazing startups, and then at one stage we finance them. And then when we have to scale up to the next step and find for hundreds of millions of euros, we got capital markets and savings that does not work. So it's a shame because we do have a lot of assets. But let me remind you, the capability of savings in the US is about 700 billion euros per year of dollars. So it's almost the double we got the double of savings available in Europe every year, than in the US. But our savings don't go where they should go. Research in Europe is a success. We got the Amphi funds, and let's not be too pessimistic. We do have assets, and of course we can have after that licorns and startups and innovations. An optimistic and pessimistic observation. Optimistic, well, the composition of the CAC 40, the stock exchange group, and companies clearly have global prestige or impact. Not in all countries, Renault doesn't sell in all countries, but it sells in all continents. At the scale of France, I think the country is not doing too badly when it comes to major corporations. There is an issue of financing and dynamism of medium SMEs, but companies are doing better, especially than the Germans, who face problem of competitiveness versus China. This is the most optimistic observation. Now, for the more pessimistic one, the notion of bottleneck. Bottleneck. This is a major issue for middle powers. Chinese and Americans have most of the bottlenecks. Finance, technology, whatever. And I think that we will have to be agile. We'll have to make choices. Maybe yield. Eat the modesty pie. It's not pleasant, but this is what's being done. Sometimes, even when confrontation with China, there will be negotiations that will take place at the custom duties, with Europe and with the US versus China, But anyway, again, if we look at things clearly, it can be understood. So, bottlenecks do exist for medium-sized powers, so middle countries. So we have to find margins of maneuver. Everybody talks about SML, but the fact in the production chain of semiconductors, Europe has a role to play. It's one way to come back to the negotiation table, but we need more of them. Douglas, you want to say something?
Comment on areas that are working, because I don't think there are very many, as you just sort of heard. But I want to give a suggestion, right? We're supposed to make suggestions. So since AI is, in my view, going to be the dominant economic social driver of the future, Japan just announced last week a 1 trillion yen effort with all of its major AI and technology companies working together. And my suggestion is that Europe, Canada, and other middle powers should all jump on board and create this new alternative. It's not going to be Mistral. It's not going to be a homegrown. But if Europe, Canada can join with Japan, which has the technological prowess and the funding, that's where I would put my effort for a middle power effort that could actually work.
Thank you so much. I think there was one question here. Yes.
Oui, merci.
Back to some of the questions mentioned. I understand that we can't win the presidential elections next year with the middle power issues, but maybe we should give hope again to the European peoples, not just, but mostly, with visions which have to be coherent with the very of Europe, which was the idea of coming out of history from the top, to endless wars. It's interesting to see that it's being abandoned in Europe. It's like the Greek tragedies, there is a negative prophecy about the future. The protagonist will react to the prophecy because anxiety tries to defend himself against the prophecy, and he speeds up the process for the achievement of the dramatic prophecy. I know the phrase, if you want peace, prepare war. I mean, this was, that was very successful phrase, but it's the phrase of an empire, an expansion empire, who, wanted to lead through war. Now, if we are in the European project, we should say, if you want peace, prepare peace. However, what is very different, and we have to look at the world as it is. This is the aggiornamento as it is, and the world we fight is very different from the world 30, 40 years, 50 years ago. It is control from the West, and the West has lost control of the world, and we have to accept it. The Carnes project is very ambiguous in a way. Is it a reconstruction of the Western Alliance, or is it going elsewhere beyond that? Because what Canada government is doing, immediately after the discourse, they intensified the relationship with China. So my question is, don't you think there is opportunity here to pull out our framework? We don't have any sort of Western moral superiority, and most of the world doesn't want to be like us. So let's accept this reality and let's go beyond the trade relationship, as you said, that function, and then we cannot build a world, pluri-universal, but with also states and nations. Thank you. We got to move just a couple of minutes. Who would like to give a word of conclusion?
So, I'm hearing a lot of questions again about coalitions and what coalitions should be formed. But I would urge a rethinking of the word coalition, because any coalition by definition is exclusive. It treats people within different from people without. And in terms of something that Europe could do, one thing I would advise is openness to foreign direct investment from countries like China. China today is the global leader in green technology. It's got something like a 30 to 40% cost advantage over Europe and all other countries. People, often Western countries, complain that the way that China developed was by ripping off Western companies which came and invested in China, which begs the question of why Europe doesn't think it's a wise idea to do the same. Open up to foreign direct investment, get the best technology from the rest of the world, and try to learn from it and come up to the frontier. This may be a humbling experience for a continent that has sort of always been at the frontier, but it no longer is. So I think it's time to have some humility and accept that there won't always be coalitions in which Europe will be sort of riding on top, but rather a general openness to the rest of the world is something that would benefit the entire world.
One last word.
Oui, non, juste un mot.
I mean, you're opening a major discussion. We would need time for that. But what I'm saying is this: you said the rest of the world doesn't want to be European or to get closer to us or to accept our system. Well, we don't want to be Americans, by the way, and the rest of the world doesn't want to be American or Chinese. So all I'm saying is that we in Europe, all the economic players we are, all the citizens we are, we are aware of the fact that if we want to exist in international competition versus the superpower, and resist, we need more Europe and a more integrated market, more international cooperation, and more licorns and success and capital markets. We have to be more European than we are today, and the presidential election will be based on this. Let's not discuss the presidential election. Sorry. More Europe, we all agree with that, so I fully agree with that. I vote for more Europe. Thank you all. Thank you to members of the panel, most interesting, maybe to the audience.
santé, vieillissement de la population, retraite, pouvoir d'achat, notre modèle de protection est véritablement confronté à de nouveaux défis.
Please take seat. We're going to start. Please take seat. We're going to start. You don't have to leave, but we'd like you to sit down. Hello. Please, if you're not staying for the session, please leave the room. Otherwise, sit down and be quiet. Let's start. My name is Jean Pisani-Ferry, member of the Cercle des Économistes, and next to me, four speakers, members of the panel who will introduce themselves. Can you introduce yourself? Reza Aliyev. Je suis
the International Center and coming from Azerbaijan. Nice to meet you.
Hello, my name is André Lezoukou-Pietri. I'm running the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which is a technology financing agency, pan-European, and our mission is bold, is to build the technology bricks that will make Europe's competitiveness and sovereignty in the future. So a DARPA type of organization, high risk, high reward. Thank you.
Bonjour, je suis Nicolas.
Nicolas Dubourg. Others in French. I think I'll be more at ease. And I run a investment company called Result. We do mainly invest in French companies, private capitals. We invest in larger companies, mainly tech and industry. And we also growing smaller growing companies. And right now, we are doing a fund leveraging for critical and dual technologies to help for our sovereignty and to. Désolé, on a un petit problème de traduction. Je suis So, let me start by introducing the panel. Sorry. Europe is used to depend on highly dependent on fossil fuels, and this was reminded by the war in Ukraine. It was reminded by the war in Ukraine was gas, and it was reminded to us by more recently, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and the fact that Europe ended up being highly dependent on oil. So we knew that, but it was nothing new, but it became obvious in a very nasty way. Now, the answer in principle would be to speed up transition, to accelerate transition to out of fossil fuels, which of course creates a new dependence, essentially vis-à-vis China, because the European Union imports roughly 90% or even more of its critical material, of this rare earth, of its lithium, and other critical material, and it imports them from China, and therefore we realized soon that here there was a new dependence, and in a way we were bracing for changing one dependence for another. So it is even more so the case that artificial intelligence will cause an explosion of demand for critical materials, and therefore we are, in principle, we are highly dependent again. Taking this into account, the European Union introduced a new legislation called Critical Raw Material Act, and which targets ambitious goals for 2030. And well, the first one is not highly ambitious. We want to extract 10% of our needs from the materials from the ground, but 40% of transformation of such materials in Europe, which changes versus the current situation, because China controls, extraction and refining, and also 25% of recycled materials. So it's also very ambitious, and total less than the objective is that we should get dependence that and no country would represent more than 65% of our supplies in critical materials. So that's the ambition. Now the question is, do get the means to achieve that, and in the meantime, something happens that's quite significant, which is the proposal by the US to have a tax silica, and which was initially initiated by the Trump administration, which was then joined rapidly by Japan, uh, uh, Australia, UK, but which has just been actually got a new member at the end of June by the European Union. So we will discuss that. It's important, and the central idea is to cover the entire supply chain of treatment of critical materials for AI. The problem is that there is no means, no formal commitment, and for the time being, it is purely a declaration of intent. So, question is it going to go far, or is it going to stop slowly after the start? So this is where we stand. This is the topic of today's discussion, and with no further ado,
Thank, thank you so much, John. And sorry that I can't speak in French. The next year, I promise I'll be better in that. And so just wanted to share a couple of my thoughts on that. And our panel is called Who Controls the Strategic Resources? But me coming from Azerbaijan, as you mentioned, the oil and gas kind of as being the energy security part of it, but with the critical minerals, with the rare earth being an increasingly important part of the strategy for the energy diversification, for everything, basically, from EVs to AI data centers, etc. I would propose to look at it from who controls the systems that transform those resources into power. And that's where the supply chain comes in, because it's not just about having the resources on the ground, but it's also about you extract it, you transport it, you refine it, you finance it. Some of our colleagues will talk about it. You insure it, you manufacture it. So having this full supply chain, which is secure and trusted, is very, very important. And that kind of moves it from the territories as a concept to the value chains and integration of it. And from that, when I look at, for example, the importance of the critical minerals, the EVs, for example, electric vehicles are using 6 times more critical minerals than traditional internal combustion engine cars. The offshore wind uses 12 times more minerals than the gas power station. So when you look at those things, and I know it's a very hot topic on this hot day, so maybe just I want to focus on three which are really particularly interesting for me. One is cobalt, being such an important one. So you have 3/4 of the all mining comes from People's Republic of DRC, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but 2/3 of it is produced in China. Impossible to catch up because China has been investing for 40 years in all of the processing. It's not the most environmentally friendly activity as well to do. It's very costly, billions of dollars. So I know there is a big now move in Europe to catch up, but it's very ambitious to have the 40% within here. The second, which is not the rare earth and maybe less glamorous, but I think very, very important, is copper. when you look at copper, it's a very important part for the electrification. Without copper, you will not have the electrification, you will not have the grids, you will not have the batteries, you will not have anything. So the energy transition really needs that. So this is basically oil and oil pipelines were fueling 20th century. Nowadays, copper is what wires the 21st century. And the third one, which might be a bit controversial as well, but I think really important, is that, because everyone talks about lithium and cobalt, but something that I want to focus your attention on is the importance of helium. We don't really think about it, we don't really talk about the helium as the important part, but I would actually put it into the critical minerals part, because you have, unlike metals, helium cannot be manufactured, and once it's out, it goes to space. But at the same time, the importance of it for everything from semiconductors to MRI scans to quantum computing to birthday balloons, everything in between is very, very important. So when we think about that, let's keep that as well. And nowadays, with the Qatar was the largest producer of helium, and now with the regional war in Middle East, the production has gone down by 40%, and it will not be able to catch up in the coming 5 years, so to go back to pre-war volumes. So that's very, very important. And what those things show us, the war in Ukraine, war in Near East, COVID, etc., is the fact that really exposes the fragility of the world. And what we need there is the resistance, right, and making it much stronger. And with that, when I look at it, coming from the Central Asia Caucasus, I think, as a voice there, not less, let's say, European, but more of the Central Asian Caucasus, it is becoming a really, really hot part, because you have Kazakhstan with a lot of uranium, a lot of critical minerals. 85% of Mendeleev table is in Kazakhstan. You have Uzbekistan, which is investing in copper and rare earth development. You have Azerbaijan moving from oil and gas. We had Ursula von der Leyen yesterday in Azerbaijan talking about that, but moving actually to become the transitional hub. And you see the interest from all big powers there. So when we think about who controls the strategic resources, you have President Trump's administration wants to do the TRIP, which is Trump's Route for International Peace and Prosperity, which will link Central Asia to Europe, and maybe Turkmenistan as well, was a massive fourth largest energy holder. You have C5+1 moving to C6+1 as the Central Asian countries. And that middle core, and then of course you have China investing into Georgia, into the Anaklia port. So I think those kind of the logistical and transportation hubs will be another source of power that we'll be focusing on. But thank you.
Thank you very much, André.
Thank you very much. Je vais le faire en français, donc.
So 3 parts. One, if there is one thing to bear in mind, is the first one, then I'll talk about the new power geography, and third, give you leads for hope on the strategic level. One, what I want you to bear in mind is that this story of rare earths, Alexander said, for 20 years that we've been asking the single market of capitals, and in a normal company, the sixth CEO would have been fired for not doing it. Same thing for rare earths. It's the first time there was an embargo on the rare earths between China and Japan, where the Prime Minister from Japan went to visit a sanctuary in Tokyo where there were war criminals buried, and China reacted in 2010 by blocking access to all rare earths, prices multiplied by 10, and since for the last 16 years it's taking place. So when I hear people that we are surprised by this dependence, and it's an existential risk for European industry, renewable, missile guiding systems, electrical vehicles, and electrical motors, well, there's a lot of sloppiness, and we have to question ourselves, and heads have to roll down as to our ability in member states in the European Union to anticipate, because clearly this is a disaster in terms of anticipation. Now, when it comes to power, clearly today power is, it has been said, power has been shifted from the producers, the mines, to the refining. Today, China, the geology is well distributed throughout the world, unequal but well distributed, where China for 15 years built an amazing position in between 70 and 90, almost 99% on refining of high magnet, for its magnet. Well, it's purification system. Since the magnets are used for their conductivity, magnetism, and they can be they have to be highly pure. As soon as they're in a purity, there is a risk of short circuits. We call it dendrites and overheating and so on. And so we need something highly pure. So China concentrated on that. And this was not a fatality, it was, in 98, the Solvay plant in La Rochelle would refine 48%, half of the rare earths in the world. Oh, there was less, but it was. So why did we change this? Because the refining process of rare earths, remember, God, we use lead, arsenic we use them as solvents, a lot of water, and often in the lanthanum especially, there are radioactive waste. So power today is for the refining. Second, the interdependence is more changing to have to think interdependence between major markets and truly there is a power to do the consideration on that. And even producers of resources, look at what the Republic of Congo did, try to do an embargo on this export of cobalt, and which has been mentioned, except that when China and the US agreed for a break, well, it was on the back of the producing countries, and they are not. So today it's no longer an issue of mines, but who controls the flows and who controls the refining. And 3 points where we could talk more about that, but anyway, strategic point I want to talk about. One, Europe is truly in the worst situation when we look at the demand and the assessed on rare earths for permanent magnets is times 6 between now and 2030, so within 36 months. And when you talk about lithium, we consider it's times 10 now in 2030, or even times 50. It's science fiction. And our production capacity was increased by 0 since the program has been taken into account. So we got mines in the Allier that might come in 2031 or 32. When you see that even countries, semi-authoritarian country like Serbia, cannot have their population accept lithium mines in their country. Can you imagine the problem they will have in Europe? Europe is in a poor position. Second, we are victims. We have collateral victims. That is today. In 2025, this activation of rare earths as a strategic weapon was a conflict between the US and China. And this is Europe that's paying the price. So now we have a problem. 6 of them. So it's dead, but exactly in 6 months. So we don't want to take this as a break. Sorry, I have to stop the translation for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, there is an emergency.
Quand même dire, c'est les pistes. C'est-à-dire aujourd'hui, où est la connexion avec le recyclage? Le recyclage nous permettrait d'aller de 1 à 20% de notre consommation d'aimants permanents. Quelle est la capacité de trouver des alternatives? Vous le citiez aujourd'hui, sans aimants permanents, pas d'éoliennes offshore. Aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas cette connexion entre stratégie terres rares, stratégie recherche, voire stratégie digitale. Et la troisième chose, très similaire au sujet de défense aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on pense règlement, alors que le vrai sujet des terres rares aujourd'hui, c'est quelle est la capacité industrielle qu'on est capable de mettre en face. Donc c'est comme aujourd'hui un drone ou une capacité militaire, c'est pas juste le produit qui compte, mais c'est est-ce qu'on est capable de produire ça à l'échelle. Donc c'est vraiment industriel de tous les pays européens, unissez-vous.
Merci. Nicolas. Alors, je vais essayer de surtout pas redire ce qui a été dit et d'essayer de prendre l'angle d'un investisseur qui n'investit pas d'ailleurs dans les minerais, mais qui a des activités qui sont très liées à l'utilisation de ces minerais, de ces métaux ou de l'énergie. Donc, les besoins de ces matériaux est en croissance de manière évidente. On vient d'en parler. Je crois que les montants d'investissement.
Sorry, the investment amounts that are expected to follow the pace is more than $500 billion worldwide for energy transition. And so we leave aside everything that's digital, which is enormous when you consider the data center project. And a personal comment, how do you do this knowing that there are a lot of transitions to finance? The aging populations, you have to make choices and concentrate on where we can be the most efficient. And the question of these strategic resources, well, I think we need to address this through collaboration, cooperation with countries, diplomacy, because we won't resource everything in Europe. We can't create as many mines as we should in Europe. It's not possible. It's not. It takes years, tens, decades, and also we're talking as a private investor. It's not possible to invest in mines. It's a lengthy process, a lot of capex. The return on investment is tied to a commodity, the price of which is set by the market in most cases. If you take lithium, for example, it was got tenfold, multiplied by tenfold, and multiplied by two again with the Iranian crisis because and to so we have private money. I'm sorry, I was an interruption. We're in general in zones where the governance is low, to say the least, or things that are not easy to manage for us. So what happens? What can we do? So there are certain projects in Europe. Europe wants to support these projects, and they're interesting. We need to take a close look at them. They need to be, some have collaterality. It's not pure raw materials. There's a part of energy, which is interesting to make them more profitable, let's say, more simpler to analyze in time. And on the other hand, what I find interesting is that we can work on technologies using these minerals, this ore, to transform it and keep added value in our countries. In the battery, chain electric batteries, for example, we're investors in the Vercor company, which is building a huge plant in Dunkirk to deliver to Renault of NMC, nickel, manganese, and cobalt, the raw materials used for that. So there, of course, there's an issue of supply. What will be in the cathode, which is the key element of these batteries. And there's some supply chain for that is done in China because the battery raw materials comes from China. Also, the CEO of Orano here. There's a project that is led by Orano in Dunkirk, which is called Neomat. That will prepare, do the pre-cam and cam to produce these cathodes used in the European batteries. A lot of added value will be done, secured here. And on recycling, there's some very interesting happening on magnets. There are two companies in France, Agrassource and another project near Bordeaux, where they are investing on the recyclability of magnets. And so these are interesting projects and with a lot of added value in our country. Thank you. Niels.
And stick to English. I wanted to, first of all, it's great to be here. I wanted to start with 3 points. It's taking a step back, right? I think it's clear that we have an issue with strategic dependencies and it's growing. Second, I think we are in the process of setting up instruments at the EU level that could make a difference, but that we design in ways that will make sure that they don't have any impact. And then third, I think in order to get out of this, we need a new Franco-German bargain. So let me just start with the first one. So of course there is an issue with strategic dependencies, right? And it goes way beyond critical minerals. We've been discussing this ever since the pandemic, at least, our growing dependency on China. If we look into the numbers, it's remarkable how little progress there has been. Like dependencies on critical minerals, on batteries, on clean tech, growingly also on things like industrial robots is increasing, not decreasing, right? And I think what we have to bear in mind, if we look into the Chinese industrial policy plan, the 5-year plan for the next couple of years, this is going to increase, not decrease, right? The industrial strategy means that more and more of our industry will depend on Chinese inputs if we don't change course. So there is clearly an issue. But we should also be very precise about the nature of this issue. When we talk about resilience in the abstract, it sometimes gets lost that we are concerned about being dependent on countries that are known to weaponize dependencies. That's China. That's to a certain extent now also the US. We're not concerned about like depending on imports from South Korea for battery imports. We're not dependent on Austria for critical minerals. It's specific dependencies on basically the two big countries that we have an issue with, and that's the US and China. And we should be very precise about this when we talk about this. Second point, I think we are making progress at the EU level to come up with an instrument that could, in theory, help. You mentioned the Critical Raw Materials Act, Jean. I think the Resource EU plan that was published last year is even more important because it goes into the direction of operationalizing. How do we get there to some of the the goals that are in the Critical Raw Materials Act? It's small and it will not fly without like real fiscal support from member states, but it's something. The second thing is in the Industrial Accelerator Act. For the first time, we will have a European preference for subsidies and public procurement in strategic industries harmonized at the EU level. And we're now talking about like a new diversification instrument on the trade side that is still a bit of an enigma, but the Commission is supposed to bring something out over the summer, right? So in theory, I think a lot of these things could help. The issue is that they are heavily contested, and that means that the Commission puts them out in ways that their impact is going to be marginal. I give you one example with the Industrial Accelerator Act, right? On paper, it's a paradigm shift. European preference harmonized across the EU in the single market. 2 years ago, for me, it would have been unthinkable that we do this, right? So on paper, in theory, conceptually, we're really moving. In practice, this is set up to fail. First, because the demand, so it's for batteries, it's for EVs, it's for clean tech, it's for some energy-intensive industries. But the demand it's going to cover, it's going to be marginal, right? The way the Commission has designed this, it would cover 3% of European steel demand, 5% of cement, about 20% of wind park equipment, less in batteries, large-scale batteries. Given that, in none of these areas, it will have any impact on investment decisions because we are over-fulfilling these criteria already. That's an issue. Second, it comes with lots of cost exemptions. So member states are free to opt out of applying these rules if they become too costly. And these exemptions are set in ways that basically make applying them optional across the board for most member states, which undermines the whole idea of setting up like common rules across Europe, right? So there's an issue by design in there. And it brings us in the worst of all worlds, right? Because on the one hand, these kinds of instruments and rules, they do create real costs, right? It's bureaucracy, it's additional red tape for companies, it's additional red tape for public authorities. But if we do this without having any economic impact, then we create costs without any gain in terms of economic, industrial capacity or economic resilience in Europe, right? So I think this is my main concern here, that we're moving conceptually, but we're doing stuff in a way that they don't make much of a difference. So the big question is, how do we get out of there, right? And since we're in X, I have to propose that we need to come up with some new big Franco-German bargain. And I think there's one there, right? Because of course, I think both sides need to move. First, Germany needs to move. It needs to understand, because traditionally, to be honest, Germany is on the side of watering things down as a export-oriented, trade-oriented economy. And the government needs to understand that like applying these things half-heartedly brings you in the worst possible spots. I think, to be honest, in Germany, we're getting there. We have a new debate on China in the last couple of months in Berlin, and I think the government is open to move on some of these things. But I think, on the other hand, the French side also needs to move, because you have won the debate on economic sovereignty, on taking a tougher stance on China. The French have been seeing this coming earlier than the Germans, and you have won this, and you should enjoy it. But we shouldn't also overdo it, right? Because I think precisely because these are instruments to deal with the specific issues of China, partly the US, they need to be designed in ways that are open and trade friendly to allied countries, right? So that means, for example, we should, of course, if we design by European rules, they should be open to suppliers from countries like the UK and South Korea and Japan, right? If we take out these countries, we end up with a protectionist instrument, and there's no reason why we shouldn't compete on fair terms for batteries with South Korea. And of course, we need to diversify in many of these areas. So if we have a solar panel strategy, the goal should be to get solar panels from Southeast Asia, not trying to build a European solar panel industry that we've lost 10 years ago, right? So I think on that side, we need to move. And I think if that happens, if Germany accepts that these things need to bite, if France makes them trade friendly, I think we can have it here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to you all. My sense is that you don't disagree on the diagnosis. You have nuances on the prescription and on the feasibility of what is being advocated, right? So may I ask each of you to sort of take one point that has been presented by colleagues and respond to it. Perhaps, Reza, you wish to start?
Of course. Well, thank you so much, and I think it was very insightful, and kind of having we do not disagree, so we agree, but there's some different aspects. Maybe one thing that to Neil's point about especially in Europe, about the policy part kind of catching up is one elephant in the room is the grid capacity, right? So even if we find financing, if we find, the Serbian, mining, not being opposed by local people, but the grid is at capacity. And if we want to, in Europe, no matter where, I live in London, be it Germany, be it, anywhere, so it will take time. So even if we find those components of financing of the, environmental cost that we can assume, but we have this very, very big problem of the grid capacity that we need to figure out how to fix that. So just put it out there.
André?
Well, actually, we disagree because, and it's in order also to, stir up the debate at 6:30 after a long day and a hot day. But, I'm French and German. These things about the French-German couple, the French-German bargains, sorry, Niels, I think it reminds me of the discourse yesterday of the Prime Minister. I understand a lot of people thought he was very insightful, and indeed, he's a nice guy, and you want to have a beer with him, and he's not playing it arrogant, etc. But when he said the state is at the middle of everything, I think we didn't get the world in which we are. The world in which we are is we need to be fast and with very calculated bets. Something that governments will never be able to be. We always expect governments to be fast, agile, and bold. They will never be. That's not their job. That's not their job. They need to set the framework. They need to set the North Star. But thinking that they will aggregate demand, thinking that they will, do an industrial meccano out of the BMW or out of Bercy, I think is an illusion, because you have a lot of people who are very good heart intended, but they are not very competent in what they are doing because they don't know the difference between a rare earth or heavy between dysprosium and other rare earths. I think we need to have frameworks which are set. Which are the frameworks? Number one, that finding alternatives is absolutely critical. Where are the major research programs trying to find alternatives to permanent magnets? That's possible. Yasmine Belkaïd from Institut Pasteur at the inaugural session said we are living a golden age of research. Let's use AI for material science. That's, by the way, what DeepMind is doing. Where is it? No, we still have no connection between the guys doing the CRM part and the guys doing the research. So this transversality on trade. Is there a connection between our development policy, which I don't think we should call development policy, with Africa, and the rare earth discussion? Not really, because
it's not called the development policy.
Well, I know. So
National partnership.
that's called partnerships, and it should be called partnership. So my point is to say, where is and third, what governments could do is the convening power. What I'm struck, I mean, we have an initiative which is called the Minerals Initiative with the European Investment Bank, and we were struck just a couple of days ago to see that the automakers are ready for 10 cents less to buy cheap lithium. So it's very difficult for investors to plan long term. You have the miners who need to have a long-term approval, and then they hear that actually it will take them 10 years, and you need to have a Notre Dame process, which is an exceptional process. Instead of doing Notre Dame processes, we need to radically simplify the way we do, but we don't see that happening.
Okay.
So aggregation of demand, research, and strategic foresight. What are the next rare earths or the next critical minerals where we are going to have a dependency? And they are pretty obvious in the next couple of years.
Nicolas?
Deux points pour faire écho à ce que vient de dire André.
2 points following what André said. The research on battery and it will be the ion lithium and maybe ion sodium. It does work, it's less performing, there's less density, wouldn't necessarily meet the needs of the automotive industry, but sodium is abundant, and maybe in 10, 15 years, we need less lithium and for what we are able to do. So AI, it's a major that this thing has to succeed with the rules we defined initially. So today we are being eaten alive, especially in the automotive industry by the Chinese who don't follow the same rules as we do. We set a framework initially which has not been applied. It is essential for these things to succeed, to protect the entire domain industry, in the automotive manufacturers and equipment suppliers and so on and so forth. It is crucial. This has to go through. Otherwise, we'll have a major social problems, lots of jobs, and political issues behind it. So prepare your questions because we after that I will leave to the
discussion. That you said that the governments can do it, and then you ask governments to do quite a lot of things. In aggregating demand, I mean, this is exactly the point of the Industrial Accelerator Act, right? Governments in the EU currently are doling out subsidies to EVs left and right. Public procurement plays a major role in the demand for energy-intensive industries. And of course, like when we decide to how do we who gets to tender in wind park auctions, governments have to take these decisions, right? So in that sense, I think we are bound to take regulatory decisions here, and we can't evade it. And we just need to understand, make the call: do we want to use that strategically? Yes or no, right? And I think what I've tried to outline is I think there's a pathway where actually these measures can help, and we are closer to a political agreement than we have been in quite some time. And I think then I'm quite confident that something will happen, right? I mean, the question is, and there's an issue of time, right? And the problem in all of this is that we need to walk and chew gum in parallel, right? So on the one hand, of course, we need to do big research investment programs in terms of batteries and new technologies for raw materials. But in the meantime, we need to decide whether we want to tariff Chinese imports or not. And again, I think that is decisions that we have to take, because otherwise, it's like if we let this rip. If there is no European car industry anymore, it's going to be very difficult to set up a battery ecosystem in Europe, right? So in that sense, I think the problem is that, of course, governments can do only some things, but on all these things, we need to take decisions, and we need to be quite fast about taking them.
Merci.
Thank you. We had an interesting discussion between who adopts a more Franco-French viewpoint and a Franco-German who adopted a more traditional viewpoint as is with Germans. As I said, I will open the discussion with the room. Who would like to take the floor? Take the microphone. I have a question, but allow me to do a brief history. No, very short, very short. It's important. Mr. With the cap, you said that 2010. Well, it so happens that I have a book. I have a works, 80 kilometers. It says in 1965 that the Chinese were starting to have a plan on the rare 75. More would say it was there, before that something. So don't come and tell us you didn't know. I have this document and I will give it to one of the members. And with Christian Stoffel, I was in the Quai d'Orsay at the time we created a group. I worked with Conservoir before, and we said, okay, well, have fun. I studied the problem and everything broke down. So this is an example of blindness. Second thing, rare earths are not rare and not new. It is Arenus, it is a Swedish military in a small city, Electria, discovered yttrium. And this is, and Steve Arenus is the one who worked on greenhouse gas, so gas effect, and we were leaders, but anyway, we must be sad to have lost that, but you said it. So, no question, you said it all. There is the problem of alliances. We know very well that in Washington, they want to be self-autonomous. Everybody says so. And Washington calls everybody in February, we have an alliance against China. So we said we don't want to align with the US, but China. But in fact, we allied with US, Japan, Pax Silica. Well, in my knowledge, France is not there because it wants to be self-contained, autonomous. So Europeans are the US, Canada, and so on and so forth. So, third question, what lessons can we draw from the failure of Lance Volta, bought by an American startup called Eaton, who will take the 5,000 people who have laid off? Are we going to see failures like that, or are we going to take up the challenge? I have 5 questions like that, so I'll shut up. I would like to react to that, especially on Pax Silica.
Northvolt.
I can maybe then I can take Northvolt. But then you can maybe even more on that. So for me, the lessons there is that at the moment it seems to be very difficult for European companies to build their own battery production from scratch, right? I think there are some clearly not just managerial failures that were made that I can't really judge, but across the board we see the areas where this really takes off is when European firms partner with South Korean companies especially, right? And of course we see a huge influx of Chinese foreign direct investment into Europe, right? And of course, and the issue is that this is, like, if we take seriously what the Chinese have announced in terms of production capacity over the next couple of years, Chinese firms in Europe will be able to supply a big chunk of European demand from within the single market, right? So the question for me is a bit, how do we make sure that there is a technological catch-up that comes with these investments, right? And there the Industrial Accelerator Act has ideas, right? Making Chinese, and it's only about Chinese investments, to be honest, making Chinese investments conditional on tech transfer, on local sourcing, on employment. I think this is a very good idea. The question for me is, are we too late with it? Because the IAA is only going to come probably take effect in a year from now, 2 years on FDI. By then, a lot of these investments will have taken place.
Sorry, why?
Because it's like the legislative procedure is until the end of this year, and then there's a I think a 6 months period until the regulation would actually take effect. Yeah.
Yes, but that's the usual
Yeah.
delays, but you know, it can be anticipated. I mean, the
Yeah, but
government can put forward
yeah.
their intention, and if companies know that it's coming, they're going to react already.
Yeah, and the Chinese are reacting in speeding up investment before the rules bite, right? So that's, I think, the strategic issue here. So the question is, how do we make sure that some of these tech transfers also happen in like investments that have already been announced? And I think there we need answers.
If I can add something, we're also very schizophrenic. And sorry, I'm not going to make a lot of friends here. But when we have these Choose France debates, we don't ask ourselves whether we are not helping competitors to the very battery companies that we have in Europe, implanted right on the doorstep, competing for talent, which was the challenge at Northvolt, because you don't have a lot of talent that really knows how to industrialize these things, competing for resources and for electricity. So I think we are very schizophrenic, and on the speed part, I mean, I was just at Volkswagen on last Thursday speaking to some of the key managers, and in the evening, you probably heard, there was this big announcement on 100,000 jobs. I mean, this is happening under our eyes. The boss of Bosch was more or less fired 3 days later, which is unheard of in German industry. And Manfred Weber just announced, the head of the EPP, that if the negotiations with China don't work out by October, then we might be in a aggressive mode. It should be next week that we take this assessment. I think we still have a political class, sorry to point to that has not understood that time is the only resources. Just watch all the candidates to presidency. Their programs is about billions. The good news is that it's speed, the currency that counts. And this is something that is actually putting a challenge to our democracies. Can democracies decide much faster than they are? If we're not able to do that, we are cooked. If we're able to change, then there is a lot of hope.
Okay. Another question?
Jean, may I react to what was said about Norfolk? Well, what happened with what remained of Norfolk, it was a US company which bought the research lab. So it's more chunk, but interesting part which remained. 300 employees. So Norvolt is an initial failure, let's face it, but it's costly. It was the first to launch into battery manufacturers, you know, therefore they get the first problems. Without going into details, you know, we financed a competitor. There are 3 competitors left, Verkor, ACC, and PowerCurve in the major players. And so Norvolt had a very ambitious project. They wanted to cover the entire chain all at once. It was complicated with several plants, with the gigafactories, with very specific Chinese machines that they had to install in the first plant at the level of the polar circle. So there were staff to be taken there, energy. So it was a very specific choice. And so don't draw hasty conclusions. It was an initial project, very complicated, but don't draw impacts on the rest of the industry, which of course, like any, you know, it's difficult to do it, but they are not in the same situation as what's happening for Norway. Thank you. I was wondering if, in your opinion, do we have to do arbitration as to the usage of some resources vis-à-vis the demand, because there is limited supply? So, you know, do you have any ideas if we have to do kind of a regulation? Could you precise, you know, arbitration of the use of resources? Should there be domains to be favored for some limited resources? Should there be sort of a choice of selection?
J'ai l'impression que ça laisse le panel.
Is the panel worried, or I'm not quite sure I got your question. Okay. It's not an, just imagine that you don't have enough copper in the years to come, or in the decades to come, to meet all the demands for digital, energy transition, automotive industry. Should we have to make choice as to the domains that will be privileged for the, and if the answer is yes, do you have any idea of how this could be organized? So indeed, it is a precise question. Well, thank God we're not yet in an administered, we're not in an administered economy. Look about memories, chips. There is a huge boom on chips because data center operators can't buy them anymore. So when you buy your Apple, now the same Apple iMac or where you had 32 giga for the same price, now you will have 16. So arbitration will be done either through the price or the resource. Likewise, so the worries we may have is if some resources are on very strategic topics like, missile guiding systems, or, well, we'll put less offshore wind farms because we'll have less permanent magnet, or the price of the electrical vehicles will be very high. Hence, our automotive manufacturers will be even less competitive versus Chinese who will have direct access to the resource without limitations or export quotas. So it may turn against us, actually.
Just maybe for that as well, for Europe, right? So arbitration, what I heard, is more like putting a brake potentially. And as you mentioned, I think it's about the speed. It's actually putting your foot on the gas. And one thing which I don't see is, for example, as I mentioned, middle corridor. Rather than having limited, let's say, copper or critical minerals here in Europe, for Europe to be in those markets, to be in the places where you can offset, you can bring, because right now US, China, they're signing 10, 15-year-old offtake agreements. But when Europe will wake up and come to our part of the world, might be a bit too late because all of that will be bought. So rather than putting the brake, I would say that for Europe, you need to be there and start signing those offtake agreements, and so people know, because right now the momentum is now. It's not going to be next week, next October, or next year.
Non, vous voulez pas? Oui, monsieur, au fond.
Sir, at the back. And then the gentleman in front, and they will stop. So, listening to you, I have the feeling that we consider that China is our deadly enemy, and don't understand why, because China is considered by Europe as the deadly enemy. Could you clarify? I didn't hear that, but I heard that China, for reasons of anticipation, capability of anticipation, well, has taken hold of refining of some rare metals and materials, and has a capacity to refining capacity, which is quite amazing. And when we allow something like this to take place, it comes a stage where countries, it's not China necessarily, but countries which are in a position of monopoly will use it. What I mean is that if Chinese are capable of selling electrical cars cheaper to Europeans, why should you refuse? Is this a reaction? Because I cannot hear what's being said. I cannot hear what's being said. Sorry. If you look at... No, let's not go into historical discussion, but it's part of it. Now, if you look at the humiliation century, there were European products, American products who went to destroy the Chinese economy, and which inundated the Chinese market. And today we end up with quite the opposite. So Europe today is facing the beginning of a century of humiliation, and this is why it's an issue. And the Chinese have been raised China is an existential threat because they won't make us to pay. So, gentlemen, the question first.
Monsieur, vous n'avez pas la parole, c'est monsieur qui est devant.
Could you just sort out the microphones, please? Because I can't hear a bloody thing. I just want to come back to a country which was mentioned, which is the Republic of Congo. President Biden, before at the end of his term, went to there was not he went into Angola next door, but then there was the president of the Republic of Congo. He talked about infrastructure corridors and so on and so forth. But recently, 6 months ago, President Trump received the Prince of Republic of Congo and Prince of Rwanda, and if I understood, we talk about infrastructure, corridor, and so on and so forth. Republic of Congo is 110 million of people who speak French as an official language and teaching language. And the Republic of Congo is biodiversity, rivers, forest, equatorial forest, and it is, of course, lithium, copper, cobalt, diamonds. So what is the French strategy today? In the current context, to cooperate not in the old ways, you know, but for true cooperation in this in the current environment. Thank you. I'm not sure someone is qualified to reply here, to answer. So I will give just one word to each of the members of the panel to close. One word, short.
Okay, maybe then just leaving you with one idea is I think one thing that would help a lot in terms of a lot of the clean tech and battery things we've been discussing is allowing production aid in Europe. That's one of the things where at the moment EU state aid rules rule out subsidies for OPEX. You only can do a CapEx. That is for a lot of, for example, batteries an issue because the problem is not capital, but it's like getting through a valley of death where you need to set up production. I think there's a simple change that you can make by allowing that, and that will help a lot. Ending with something concrete.
Thank you. Nicolas?
Très rapidement aujourd'hui.
I would like to react to the question that we have not been able to answer. I strongly believe that when it comes to minerals and raw material, we need international cooperations and with constructive and collaborative exchange on the other side, because again, we cannot finance everything. We don't have the means to do everything. We have to define our priorities, work with friends within the framework of international cooperations, and then it will be strategic. First, look at the IPCEID European Program of Common Interest. We put 6 billion in batteries. Roughly, we said, make better batteries. What we should have done is to say, take the best battery from CATL, which is the best Chinese, and we will give you 6 billion, even more, if you can do batteries which are twice, 6 times, 5 times better than the current batteries. So we gave money to BASF, Total, Varta, which is almost bankrupt. Now, did we succeed in changing the situation? No. You know, I lived in Beijing for 10 years, which is why I do what I do. I mean, I do have a lot of admiration for China, and somehow I agree with you. The problem today is not that China is doing well. The problem is Europe. We are so bad on we were good, but we were not able to succeed because we are in process, and regulations is a process, and we are not in the mission. The mission is to have better batteries. It would be to have refining that would not cost, which would be green. We were happy for 20 years that the Darcy refining of rare earths was in internal Mongolia. We don't want it in La Rochelle or Aix-en-Provence. This is what we have to do. Maybe one last thing about RDC, Republic of Congo. 73% of cobalt resource in Marifa, but 80% of refining of cobalt is controlled by China. So the disconnection. So I don't know what mining groups expect for in Europe to major challenge and to invest, not to do development, but I mean, the French development agency, I think it has to be restricted entirely or even shut it down, and rebuilt it. But to make sure that, but I think this is we have to be bold enough in Europe, but do a true process and stop doing just small refining. Northvolt, the right challenge, but every morning there was a plane leaving from Stockholm, taking the engineers, coming back on Friday night, something mad. So come on, let's be sensible. Europe has to have technological challenges. Je pense qu'une des choses que je peux vous dire, c'est qu'il y a l'Europe doit accepter qu'il y a cette course Chine-USA. L'Europe n'en fait plus partie, mais identifier ce à quoi elle est bonne, l'ingénierie, les recherches, etc. Et trouver peut-être la France, l'Allemagne, le Japon, etc. Donc ne pas être là simplement dans cette course, mais de trouver l'endroit où ils peuvent être forts et se focaliser sur ça. Merci. Thank you. No word of conclusion. Time is short. Bye bye. Thank you.
Tous d'avoir participé à ce débat qui est essentiel.
Shall we do it?